The English Revolution. Part 2. The Diggers. The Levellers were not the only radical social movement to flourish at this time. Associated in the popular mind with the Levellers are the group that has come to be known as the Diggers, their name coming from an attempt by a group of more radical reformers to appropriate and use some uncultivated common land with a view to feeding the poor. On the 1st of April 1649, a small group of radicals, some 20 or 30 men, including Gerard Winstanley, came together on St. George's Hill in Walton-on-Thames and began to cultivate the wasteland, thereby digging, hence their name. After clashes with local landowners, the group moved in August to Cobham Heath, just over a mile from Walton, and continued their activities there. Similar disturbances ensued, and by the spring of 1650 the colony was unable to continue. Walton and Cobham were the two most prominent digger enterprises, though there were also some attempts at other places in other counties, such as Northamptonshire, Kent, Hertfordshire, Middlesex and Bedfordshire. The efforts of the diggers were ephemeral, the numbers actively involved tiny, and the result a resounding practical failure. As a practical experiment, the whole thing lasted just over a year, after which it collapsed under the weight of legal threats and popular resistance. The theoretical outcome was the production of some pamphlets by the writer most closely associated with the diggers, Gerard Winstanley. We have seen that the Levellers were accused of implicitly or explicitly proposing the reduction of all social distinctions to one level and of envisaging a radical restricting of property rights. We have also seen the leading Levellers vehemently deny that such was their programme, although Overton perhaps gave some ground for that suspicion when he proposed that those commons which had been enclosed should be made available once again for the free use and benefit of the poor. A reappropriation by the poor of much of the land of England was precisely the programme of the diggers. To draw a rough but not inaccurate contrast between the two movements, we might say that while the Levellers were concerned with political reform first and foremost and with economic reform only in a subsidiary way, the diggers were concerned with political reform by economic means. If the Levellers were few and the period of their influence brief, the diggers were even fewer and the time of their influence even more brief. The Levellers appealed to the law of nature to support their claims, so too did the diggers. But whereas the Levellers saw natural law as supporting individual rights, including the right to property, the diggers saw it as supporting the right of all to the basic means of subsistence, which, in the context of the 17th century, meant access to land with the rights of the individual limited to a share in the common produce. From the digger perspective, land is given to all for the good of all, and no one may appropriate to himself alone what belongs to all. The digger movement is not without historical antecedents. In England there had been the short-lived Peasants' Revolt of 1381, of course, but much more immediately relevant was the German Peasant Revolt of the 16th century. All of these disturbances had their theoretical root in the Christian belief that private property was a result of original sin, and that common ownership of all natural resources was the original and better disposition of things. In the context of this belief, the standard justification of private property was that it was the practically best way to arrange matters given man's fallen nature. However, the diggers believed that private property was not so much the product of sin but its cause. Private property is not the result of original sin. Original sin is rather the result of private property. Sabine captures this thought well when he writes that for the diggers the root of all evil is covetousness and greed, which first produce private property, while the latter causes all supremacy of one man over another, all manner of bloodshed, and the enslaving of the masses of men who have been reduced to poverty by the wage system and are forced to support by their labour the very power that enslaves them. Consequently, most social ills and most of human vice can be removed by destroying private property, especially in land. 100 years after the English Civil War, in a different country and in a different language, private property will once again be identified as the root of all social evil. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, to whom it had occurred to say, 'This is mine,' and found people sufficiently simple to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, murders, how many miseries and horrors mankind would have been spared by him who, pulling up the stakes or filling in the ditch, had cried out to his kind, "Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits are everyone's and that the earth no one's." If the digger influence ran into the sand, Rousseau's influence, as we shall see, would irradiate all subsequent political thought. Still, Winstanley's position on the land question did have its later followers. The interest taken in Winstanley by late 19th century British radicals reflected the immense importance of the land question in late Victorian Britain. Henry George writes, "Poverty deepens as wealth increases, and wages are forced down while productive power grows, because land, which is the source of all wealth and the field of all labour, is monopolised. To extirpate poverty, to make wages what justice demands they should be, the full earnings of the labourer, we must therefore substitute for the individual ownership of land a common ownership. Nothing else will go to the cause of the evil." In the quasi-mythical digger account of history, the people of England have been held in subjection ever since William the Conqueror and his henchmen arrived in 1066 and took all the land and divided it up among themselves. The law is simply a device backed by physical sanctions for preserving the status quo, and the whole apparatus of persisting robbery is defended by the ideological apparatus of the Church, whose apologists for this flagrant wrongdoing are rewarded by a share of the booty in the form of tithes. Were the diggers issuing a call to outright revolution? No. In fact, the diggers tended towards pacifism rather than militancy. What they wanted, in practical terms, was the right to cultivate the extensive acreage of unenclosed common land while leaving the existing enclosed property as it was. The Levellers had John Lilburne, Richard Overton, and William Walwyn to make their case. The diggers effectively had one man, the semi-mystic Gerard Winstanley. Winstanley's public activities took place over a very short period between 1648 and 1652, and the practical side of those activities took place primarily in the year 1649. Winstanley has been claimed by many subsequent thinkers as presaging their particular concerns, not least by Marxists and Socialists. However, George Woodcock, the author of Anarchism, sees him as anticipating Kropotkin's notion of mutual aid, and thus beginning the anarchist tradition of direct action. George Orwell, too, sees Winstanley as a predecessor of anarchism rather than of socialism. The tract, A Declaration of the Poor Oppressed People of England, written by Winstanley and 44 others, was an appeal addressed to those that are called Lords of the Manor, and is in the main a declaration of intent on the part of the diggers to take and make use of the land, specifically the commons, which they believe was given to all for the use of all. The main thing we aim at, and for which we declare our resolutions to go forth and act, is this: to lay bold upon, and as we stand in need, to cut and fell and make the best advantage we can of the woods and trees that grow upon the commons, to be a stock for ourselves and our poor brethren through the land of England, to plant the commons withal, and to provide us bread to eat, till the fruit of our labours in the earth bring forth increase. And we shall meddle with none of your properties but what is called commonage, till the Spirit in you make you cast up your lands and goods, which were got and still is kept in your hands by murder and theft. Winstanley and his co-authors disclaim any intention to interfere with settled property, even though it had been acquired by violence and dishonesty. They write, "For though you and your ancestors got your property by murder and theft, and you keep it by the same power from us that have an equal right to the land with you by the righteous law of creation, yet we shall have no occasion of quarrelling, as you do, about that disturbing devil, called particular property. For the earth with all her fruits of corn, cattle, and such like, was made to be a common storehouse of livelihood to all mankind, friend and foe without exception." The diggers take grave exception to money and trade. They write, "We must make use of gold or silver as we do of other metals, but not to buy and sell withal. For buying and selling is the great cheat that robs and steals the earth one from another. It is that which makes some lords, others beggars, some rulers, others to be ruled, and makes great murderers and thieves to be imprisoners and hangers of little ones, or of sincere-hearted men. In another appeal, this one entitled A Watchword to the City of London and the Army, Winstanley defends the diggers' adventure on St. George's Hill by reminding the City of London and the Army that they, with others, have given their money and their service to rid England of the royal tyranny. He writes, "All sorts have paid taxes, free quarter, excise, or adventured their lives to cast out that kingly office, and so those from whom money and blood was received ought to obtain freedom in the land to themselves and posterity by the law of contract between Parliament and people." Winstanley vigorously denies that the diggers' activities on St. George's Hill are in any way an infringement of the rights of others. Apart from his tractarian literature, Winstanley produced one substantial book, The Law of Freedom, his single most sustained piece of writing, which came out in 1651-1652, towards the end of his active involvement in politics. The basic idea of this work is that poverty is the ground of all that restricts and limits human freedom. To be free is not just to be unfettered, but to be able to use the earth and its produce. Politically, Winstanley saw two possible modes of social organisation. One, based around the idea of the preservation of all, is at the root of the Commonwealth in which all, strong and weak alike, are protected. The other, based around the idea of self-preservation, is at the root of royal government and is productive of covetousness and of tyranny. In this latter mode, land is held by some to the exclusion of others and bought and sold as any other commodity. There can be no true equality or liberty unless all land is held in common. In the striking anticipation of certain communist tenets, Winstanley would have it that all should have access according to their needs from a common store. In the slightly more chilling anticipation, Winstanley would have it that all should be compelled to work productively up to a certain age. Personal property would not be affected by the communalisation of land. Winstanley's thought, says Sabine, rested upon a clear insight into the inevitable dependence of political liberty and equality upon the control of economic causes. Nowhere is there a clearer perception of the incompatibility of economic exploitation with democratic ideals. True freedom for Winstanley is not a freedom to buy and sell, to be uncoerced in religious matters or the like. It lies in the free enjoyment of the earth. A man, he writes, had better to have nobody than to have no food for it. Therefore, this restraining of the earth from brethren by brethren is oppression and bondage. But the free enjoyment thereof is true freedom. He anticipates some obvious objections to the digger platform. It will lead to idleness if all belongs to all. There will have to be a community of person as well as property, a community of all men and women for copulation, and there will be no law for lack of government. Winstanley responds that there will be no idlers, for all will be made to work. While the storehouses are commonly furnished, yet houses and their contents will belong to individual families, and personal relations, conjugal and familial, will remain private. And as for government, government is the wise and free ordering of the earth and the manners of mankind by observation of particular laws or rules, so that all the inhabitants may live peaceably in plenty and freedom in the land where they are born and bred. The genuine root of government is a concern for the preservation of all, to seek the good of others as himself. But the concern for self-preservation is the root of tyranny. Magistrates are to be chosen yearly, for long service in office tends towards corruption. The heart of man is so subject to be overspread with the clouds of covetousness, pride, and vainglory. For though at the first entrance into places of rule they be of public spirits, seeking the freedom of others as their own, yet continuing long in such a place where honours and greatness is coming in, they become selfish, seeking themselves and not common freedom. Winstanley envisages a variety of public offices: representatives, peacemakers, overseers, soldiers, taskmasters, and judges. The heart of his scheme, however, lies not in these arrangements, but in his pre-romantic vision of a society producing and distributing what they need simply on the basis of need. After a minimal formal education, all the children are to be set to occupations connected to the basic activities of husbandry, mining, pastoralism, and woodcraft, and all trades derivative from those primary activities, such as shoemaking, tailoring, carpentry, and the like, at which activities and trades they will work until the age of 40. After that, work is optional, and only those retired from work shall be eligible to serve as officers. All that is produced is to be placed in storehouses or other depositories from which people are free to take what they need without recourse to buying and selling. If all this sounds suspiciously familiar, it should, for it is a staple of two forms of organization, communist countries and some religious orders. There can be no doubt that there was a strong mystical religious streak in Winstanley, a common enough feature of public life in 17th century England. His earliest writings are, to me at least, largely incomprehensible, my opinion being shared by many commentators, though some recent scholarship has claimed to discern elements of Winstanley's later work in these relatively juvenile works, relative because Winstanley was nearly 40 years older when he first wrote. Winstanley's The New Law of Righteousness exhibits some of the mystical opacity of his earlier writings, but it also contains a clear expression of his fundamental view that no man was made to be lord over another, and that all men have been given equal rights to access the earth and its resources. Apart from being a mystic, Winstanley was also a millenarian. His early publications, The Mystery of God and Breaking of the Day of God, are described by Gurney as being overtly millenarian works and strikingly anti-clerical and anti-formalist. And Winstanley's millenarianism was evident in almost all his writings. We can have heaven on earth. The problem of scarcity is ultimately not a problem at all. There is enough and to spare for everyone. All that we have to do is to divide things up equitably. Distribution is the only problem we have. Production is scarcely problematic once the temptation to idleness is overcome. Winstanley's vision is of a world in which everything is restored to perfection and freed from conflict, poverty, and oppression. Winstanley may perhaps be forgiven for his naivety. The same forgiveness, however, can scarcely be extended to us. We have seen just how well this works in communist countries. The basic problem, apart from the massive and insuperable problem of lack of incentives, being that in such a system there is simply no way to discover what needs to be produced, how much of it, where, and when. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Such was Winstanley's ideal. Such was the communistic commonwealth he evidently imagined would naturally evolve if only the equal claims of all to the use of the earth were once recognized and respected. Winstanley was a communist, one of the very first communists, and like all communists he had a tenuous grasp on economics. Some have discerned a change between Winstanley's earlier writings and The Law of Freedom, believing that the latter work has often seemed troubling and less an advance on his earlier positions than a retreat from the optimistic belief in human perfectibility that permeated the New Law of Righteousness. Compared to the anarchic enthusiasm of the writings between 1648 and 1650, the concrete proposals detailed in The Law of Freedom can seem authoritarian and domineering. Whatever the truth of this matter, Winstanley's essential and unchanging argument was this: the earth belongs to all. It is a common treasury. But covetousness brought it about that some appropriated for themselves what belonged to all. This led to the creation of a power, the state, capable of protecting these ill-gotten gains. Covetous appropriation by a few of what belongs to the many is, according to Winstanley, the source of all wars and bloodshed, theft and slavery. If we desire these evils to be eliminated, then the source of these evils, private property, must be abolished. We have seen that for many Christian thinkers, private property was understood to be a result of original sin, a pragmatic solution to the problems that arise in our post-Edenic existence. For Winstanley, however, covetousness and the private appropriation of property either are the causes of man's first sin or just are that first sin. Winstanley, too, understood that state power is related to the property system, so that, in his view, political freedom cannot be had without substantial economic equality, and that, in turn, requires the abolition of private property. Hill goes so far as to claim that the Levellers sought to establish political democracy, a state in which the poorest would be as free as the richest. They based this on a system of inalienable natural rights, one of which was a right to property. This at once gave rise to contradictions. In order to safeguard the property rights of small men against the rich and powerful, some Levellers would have withheld the vote from those who were economically dependent, servants and paupers. Winstanley, like the Levellers' shrewdest critic, Commissary General Ireton, saw that a right to accumulate property was incompatible with liberty. For Ireton, this was a decisive argument against extending the vote to those who were not landowners or freemen or corporations. For Winstanley, it was an argument for complementing political freedom by economic freedom. In his earlier writings, Winstanley seemed to envisage a reformed society existing without any or with little government. In his later writings, he had moved to support at least a minimal state responsible for the preservation of law and order. The Diggers and the Levellers agreed on many things. While there were internal differences between the leading Levellers, with some, such as Overton, more inclined to radicalism, it is true to say that the Levellers sought political reform without any specific intent to disturb the existing property regime. Ireton, in the Putney debates, argued against them that their demands, logically pursued, were incompatible with the rights of property, and here he and Winstanley would appear to be in agreement. The difference being, of course, that Ireton took this as a reason to reject the Levellers' political demands, while Winstanley took it as a reason to link political reform with economic reform. Once Oliver Cromwell took power, the fluid post-conflict political situation hardened, and it seemed for a time as if a new royal dynasty was going to be established. The prospect of this produced one spectacular piece of writing from this period that doesn't fit neatly into either the Leveller or the Digger camp, but harkens back to an earlier tradition of the justification of tyrannicide that we saw in the Vindiciae contra Tyrannus. This is Edward Sexby's, also known as William Allen's, Killing No Murder. This tract has to be one of the most extraordinary productions of the revolutionary period, both in content and in sustained literary sardonic style. It is a general defence of tyrannicide, addressed to the specific desired object of that exercise, Cromwell. Nothing in life, Sexby thinks, will become Cromwell better than his leaving of it. He says, "To your Highness justly belongs the honour of dying for the people, and it cannot choose but be unspeakable consolation to you in the last moments of your life to consider with how much benefit to the world you are like to leave it." Sexby believes three questions need to be considered. First, is Cromwell a tyrant? Second, if he is it lawful to kill him? And third, if lawful, would his killing be beneficial or harmful to the Commonwealth? Let's look at Sexby's treatment of the first two of these questions. Sexby makes the common distinction between two types of tyrant. Those who, although entitled to govern, do so tyrannically, and those who are not entitled to govern at all. To further his accusation of tyranny against Cromwell, Sexby supplies us with a list of characteristics of the tyrant which he has gleaned from a variety of sources, including Plato, Aristotle, Tacitus, and Machiavelli. Many tyrants begin their career as military defenders of the people against oppression, which oppression, that battle won, they themselves resume. They use fraud more than force. They eliminate all possible competitors and all persons of excellence. They limit or prohibit public assemblies. They are always well guarded. They impose burdensome taxes and duties and excise on the people. They use war as a way to divert people from the ills they suffer and as a spurious means of justifying the taxes and levies. They use others to do their dirty work. They pretend to love God and even to be divinely inspired. On all these counts, Cromwell fits the bill. The answer to the first question then is yes, Cromwell is a tyrant. So he now asks Cromwell for the source of his authority. Who, he asks, made thee a prince and a judge over us? If God, please show us evidence of this. If the people, how was this done? If to change the government without the people's consent, if to dissolve their representatives by force and disannul their acts, if to give the name of the people's representatives to confederates of his own, that he may establish iniquity by a law, if to take away men's lives out of all the course of law by certain murderers of his own appointment, whom he names a high court of justice, if to decimate men's estates, and by his own power to impose upon people what taxes he pleases, and to maintain all by force of arms, if, I say, writes Saxby, all this does make a tyrant, his own impudence cannot deny, but he is as complete a one as ever has been since there have been societies of men. Cromwell then is a tyrant, and a tyrant without title. As a tyrant without title, may Cromwell be lawfully killed. Saxby adheres to the traditional view that a ruler who has degenerated into a tyrant may be brought to justice by the people's representatives, but not by a private individual acting without authority. However, tyrants without title are simply criminals who are entitled to no benefit from human society and to no protection from the law. Men enter society to live and to live well, and to do so they submit to the law of reason and justice. Without law, Saxby remarks in a Hobbesian manner, men's appetites would quickly make society as unsafe or more than solitude itself, and we should associate only to be nearer our misery and our ruin. But the tyrant without title is under no law. He is not only not a magistrate, he is not even a member of society properly conceived. A tyrant, he says, being no part of the Commonwealth, nor submitting to the laws of it, but making himself above all law, there is no reason why he should have the protection that is due to a member of a Commonwealth, nor any defence from laws that does acknowledge none. As the tyrant without title, then, is not under any law, individuals may defend themselves against him by appropriate means, including deadly force, if necessary. In a passage that recalls the famous interview between Alexander and the pirate, and which will warm the hearts of libertarians, Saxby writes, "For what can be more absurd in nature and contrary to all common sense, than to call him thief, and kill him that comes alone with a view to rob me, and to call him Lord Protector, and obey him that robs me with regiments and troops? But if it be the number of adherents only, not the cause, that makes the difference between a robber and a protector, I wish that number were defined, that we might know where the thief ends and the prince begins, and be able to distinguish between a robbery and a tax."